I want to talk more generally about the Irish power system and the excess capacity that currently exists, which Fred referred to. But I just want to summarize quickly again some of the main points he made. A power system is a system. You have to have lots of different kinds of power stations. Demand fluctuates dramatically from winter to summer. It fluctuates dramatically during the day. Unfortunately, you can't store the stuff. If you want to get incredibly rich very quickly, invent an enormous and really cheap battery. That is the way to get richer than Bill Gates in a very short space of time. And I'm an economist rather than an engineer, but the idea that there is a product whose demand fluctuates and which people regard as vital, the idea that demand and supply must be balanced instantaneously is an incredibly difficult constraint. And economists are used to people saying our industry is different. Everybody thinks their industry is different, which usually means it should get generous treatment. The electricity industry actually really is different. The idea that demand and supply have to be balanced simultaneously is very unusual, and it's very demanding, and it makes that industry very special. Consider the ice cream industry. If every time you felt like an ice cream, some fella somewhere had to both produce the flippin' ice cream instantaneously and deliver it to you wherever you happen to be, and it was impossible to store the stuff. Well, that's the electricity business. So it's a very strange industry. The other point that, that Fred made, which is inadequately understood here in Ireland, is that if you run the intermittent power stations, and the intermittent power stations in Ireland are nearly all windmills, if you run them and they get dispatched into the grid, onto the system, somebody else somewhere else has to shut down. And the guys in practice that have to shut down are the gas-fired stations. We have coal stations and we've hydro and some other things. But basically it's the gas people that have to shut down. The efficiency, the conversion efficiency in modern gas stations is amazing. I was on the board of the ESB back in the 1980s. At that time, 46 or 7% was regarded as pretty good. There are some that have been built here, 55, 56, and some are able to get up, as Fred mentioned, up to 58 and 60% in conversion efficiency. It's quite amazing. It's got to do with material science, and the combustion temperatures are much higher than they used to be. The engineers have figured out how to do this. But these stations were not designed for intermittent usage. They were designed to be run flat out as baseload stations. They're beginning to design some of them now, I understand, for intermittent usage, but there's a whole bunch of combined cycle gas stations which are high conversion efficiency stations with much lower carbon emissions than coal or oil. There's hundreds of them around Europe. We've quite a few here in Ireland. And these stations were not designed for intermittent use. So if you keep switching them on and switching them off as the wind blows or it doesn't blow, then you're wearing them out. Essentially, you're heating them up and cooling them down. And with any piece of equipment, if you want to shorten its life, keep heating it up and cooling it down and see what happens. And any mechanical engineer will tell you that you stress the equipment. Now, you can design it in such a way that that is okay, but it's a more expensive piece of equipment. If you want to design a combined cycle gas unit such that intermittent use does not shorten its life, then you can do that. The material science people can do almost anything, but it costs extra. I met a chap in London a few years ago who used to work in the power industry in the UK, and I asked him what I thought was a simple question. The question was the following. if a combined cycle unit has an expected life of, let's say, 20 years or 25 years, if you run it constantly as a baseload station, by how much do you shorten it if you keep cycling, intermittent use, they call it, cycling the stations? And he looked at me for a while and he said, the essence of the problem is that we do not know the answer to that question. We don't know. We've never done it. And he said, what's happened in Britain, in Ireland, in Denmark, and various other places, is that combined cycle stations were built without the expectation that they would be used intermittently, because people didn't realize how much wind was going rid of the system. So how long they last with this pattern of intermittent usage, the engineers don't really know. And we might be lucky or we might not. The other point Fred made that's important is that when you're ramping them up and down, they burn more gas, so their efficiency diminishes and their emissions go up. And that is one of the sources of the gap between the nominal emission reductions and the actual ones that you get in the real world. So if I can just stand back a little bit from all this and just talk about power generation capacity, and I'm going to put my watch in front of me because I don't want to incur the wrath of our very efficient chairman. So I want to give you a bit of history about the Irish power system. This is a pretty small power system here, and it had no interconnection, or very little, until relatively recently. It's now an all-island system, and the north and the south are interconnected. They're not very well interconnected, and we're going to have to build at some stage better connections north-south within the island for reasons I won't bore you with. It's also connected to Wales. There was an interconnector built over to Wales a few years back. It was very costly. And there is an interconnector between Northern Ireland and Scotland. Half of it is not working properly. Apparently the people who built the underwater cable sold us a bit of frontier technology, and it doesn't quite work properly, so it's going to have to be fixed. But the system is interconnected to a degree. Within Ireland, back in the 1980s, there was no functioning interconnector. So the Republic system was a separate system from the Northern system. At that time, the Electricity Supply Board ended up, and it was at the time a monopoly, vertically integrated power company. It ran all generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. It doesn't anymore, as you know. There are other generators, and there's other people in retail. In the 1980s, the ESB ended up with too much capacity. And the way that happened was the following. In the 70s, the economy did pretty well for a while. Capacity got tight, and the engineers went off and said, let's plan more capacity. And it's hard to match capacity with demand in an electric power system. It takes 6, 8, 10 years to build power stations. It takes many years to build transmission lines and all that. So you can easily get periods, and you do, when the system has tight capacity, which means a risk of blackouts, and you get other periods when the system has excess capacity, which means high prices, ultimately, for somebody. So in the 1980s, the system ended up with too much capacity. In the 70s, people played around with the notion that they might build a nuclear plant here. And there was talk about building a nuclear plant in the southeast of Ireland, down in County Wexford. Nuclear plants don't come at small sizes, so it was debatable whether that was such a bright idea. And it didn't happen. They did build a big coal plant, though. And the sensible place to build a coal plant in Ireland is on the west coast, because coal comes from the mid-Atlantic states of the US and from Colombia and places like that. And they found a very appropriate site on Shannon. Shannon has deep water, and that's why the plant is at Money Point. There's deep water up further north, and there's deep water, I guess, down in Castletown, Bearhaven, places like that. But Shannon is kind of in the middle of Ireland, if you know what I mean. So from a transmission point of view, it was a smart place to put it. It was originally designed to be 1,200 megawatts. Any of you who have ever seen the Money Point plant, which is the biggest single power station in Ireland, will have noticed something funny about it. There's two great big towers, and there's two units of 300 megawatts each underneath one of the towers, but the other tower, same tower, has only one unit of 300 megawatts. So the plant is 900 megawatts, but it was meant to be 1,200, and the reason it isn't is because the board, of which I was a member at the time, said, oh no, there's no demand for electricity. So the final unit in Money Point was never built, but that was designed to be a 1,200 megawatt coal station. It's now 900. And through the 1980s, the company had also built some gas units because there was a gas discovery at the Kinsale Head field off Cork in the late 70s. There was very little use for the gas in Ireland, really, apart from wasting it by making fertilizer out of it, which we did for a while, and eventually stopped. So some gas units were built. But there was excess capacity, and there was just a logical reaction by the ESB, which I remind you was the monopoly in charge of the entire power industry at that time. And they said, we're in a hole, stop digging, stop building power stations. So we stopped building power stations. And electricity was expensive for a while. But eventually, demand recovered in the 1990s, and power prices came down. And eventually, the industry began to take a different shape with new people allowed into both generation and supply end of the industry. And people started building power stations again. But what's happened now? Well, again, Fred touched on this. The total peak demand for electric power in Ireland as a whole is 6,800 megawatts. So if you had 6,800 megawatts of installed and dispatchable, which means permanently available, capacity, you would just about manage to meet peak demand. But you'd have absolutely no margin for anything to go wrong. And engineers don't like running a power system where the capacity is only 100% of peak demand. They know that something's going to go wrong, and they like to have capacity at 110% or 115% of peak demand. And that leaves room for something to go wrong. Obviously, if you're interconnected with other systems, that makes that easier. Where are we now? We have dispatchable capacity on the island as a whole, from memory, that is over 10,000 megawatts. And by dispatchable capacity, I mean gas, hydro, coal. There's some coal stations in the north, still some oil stations left. We make electricity out of peat, which is pretty amazing, but we do. It's got higher emissions even than coal. So we have a surplus of capacity here, which is quite costly and has caused losses for people who've invested in it, as well as high prices for consumers. We have a surplus of capacity even if we had no intermittent wind power at all. When you add in the intermittent wind power and some other bits and pieces, the total capacity in the system, north and south, is somewhere around 13,000 megawatts. That's getting on for double peak demand if all the wind happened to be available, which of course it rarely is, as Fred pointed out. Now, there is an issue about carbon emissions and meeting targets and all that. But start back from it. What do you do when you have a large excess of generating capacity? Well, you do what the ESB did in the 1980s. You ring up the guys and you tell them, will you stop building power stations? We don't need them, we've got enough of them. We'll wait until the economy recovers and demand picks up again. And the older stations do get retired all the time. Stations wear out, and you can just let them expire gracefully. We didn't do that with the peak stations. The 3 peak stations we have here now, between them, I think they're about 300 or 350 megawatts between them. It's not that big. They're incredibly expensive. They have very high emissions, and they were built in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s. So the old turf stations were about to expire gracefully, and the politicians simply could not resist building brand new ones, and they are hugely subsidized. So the subsidy arrangements in Ireland now is that wind has very low lifetime emissions, gas is in the middle somewhere, coal has high emissions, and oil has high emissions, and peat has the highest emissions. The Irish policy is to subsidise the lowest emissions and the highest ones, which is pretty hard to come up with a policy like that. I want to turn from the question of capacity to the question of the subsidisation of wind. People sometimes proceed on the basis that the subsidy to wind generators is simply the refit tariff. This is this guaranteed minimum tariff that they get. There are other hidden subsidies. The biggest one is transmission. Because conventional power stations are large and are located in one place, Money Point is located in one place. The gas stations, typical combined cycle station in Ireland is about 400, 450 megawatts. You've got to build one set of wires into that station connected to the grid. If you had 400 megawatts of windmills in the best locations for them, where the wind is best, they would take up an entire county. So you've got to build extra wires in all directions. There are very substantial costs imposed on the transmission system when you have a lot of dispersed wind power. And the wind generators do not pay these costs. They only pay shallow transmission costs, or shallow connection costs, they call them, to the nearest point on the grid. They don't pay for all the grid strengthening that has to go on elsewhere. And EirGrid have admitted, that's the right word, that most of their transmission investment plans in Ireland in the next few years are to accommodate extra wind farms that we're still encouraging. I want to say a few other things about other kinds of renewables. The government announced, amazingly, about last October, I think it was, that they're going to build a brand new power station in Killala, which is small, it's 40 megawatts. Really don't see the point. And it's going to make electricity out of wood chips shipped into Dublin port from the southern states of the US and trucked across some way to Mayo. Mayo is not a promising place to grow timber. It's rocky up there. And this extraordinary Heath Robinson power station is going to get the subsidy, the same subsidy that is given to the wind people, on the debatable grounds wood chip plants are kind of renewable because you can plant the trees again in Georgia or wherever it is. A pretty amazing decision. There was an announcement by the Minister for the Environment, Mr. Kelly, in Nina a few weeks ago of a 350 megawatt hydro station. Don't know if any of you spotted that, on the site of the old silver mines project. And somehow or another, they're going to find, there must be a river somewhere nearby. Maybe they haven't checked that yet. There's, you can have your artificial lake because the mine has all been excavated and so on. But of course, this would be a hydro scheme and it would get the refit subsidy. So far as I know, and you don't need to have done a lot of economics now to follow this bit, nobody in Ireland is offering to add a single megawatt of capacity without subsidy. The wind people are queuing up to get subsidised and a guaranteed price for 15 years. The guy in Killala, amazingly, appears to have qualified for this subsidy for shipping in wood chips from Georgia. The fellows that want to build a hydro station up in North Tipperary are doubtless expecting to get subsidised. And of course, there's all sorts of people running around offering solar plants, which would also be intermittent, and they expect to get a subsidy as well. So that's all fine. In other words, nobody is offering to build any power stations in Ireland without subsidy. This is not surprising. If you have excess capacity of the type I've been talking about, then nobody in their right mind would build any more. Some of the people who did build gas turbines have lost money. They've lost a lot of money, including the government. One of the ones which was sold as part of the BGE power gen privatisation a year ago, it cost them 400 million to build, and they got about 100 million for it. So Joe taxpayer dropped 300 million on that one. I want to just finish with a few points. Am I getting there? I want to finish with a few points about what on earth should we do, starting from here. It's really important that it should be brought home to the government that there are two brute facts about power gen. The first is that we have a huge amount of excess capacity. The second is that we have high prices. This is not a coincidence. The costs of transmission and distribution and of some of the power gen and all the subsidies and so on end up in your monthly electricity bill. And it was like that in the 80s. We had excess capacity. It was a simpler industry then. It was a vertically integrated monopoly. But we had excess capacity. The ESB built too much capacity, stopped in fairness, but didn't stop quick enough. Very hard to stop quick enough. Economy was very flat. Too much capacity, high prices. That is exactly the situation that we're in now. We have too much capacity, and your electricity bill is about 30% higher than it would be in the UK. And in most other European countries, except Denmark and Germany. This is not a coincidence either. So the first thing we need to do is to stop building power gen capacity. That leaves the question, though, what about our targets and what about carbon emissions? And surely we should cut carbon emissions. I entirely agree. I am completely convinced by the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but these guys look like experts to me. And it seems to me that the case has been made that the combustion of fossil fuels is one of the contributors to climate change. It's not the only, sometimes you think it was the only one, The power gen industry is a significant producer of carbon emissions, of course it is, but it's not as significant as the transport industry, the household sector through home heating and all that, agriculture and so on and so forth. But it's a substantial producer of carbon emissions. In this part of the world, we produce less carbon emissions than we used to do because we don't have as much coal, although people are beginning to build coal stations again, which is bizarre. There's a lot of nuclear in Europe, as much hydro as we can put in, and the modern gas stations are relatively low emission stations. So it's not clear to me that if in Ireland we are to make our contribution to cutting carbon emissions, it's not clear to me that building more flipping power stations is the way to do it. And finally, it is not clear to me either that we haven't made substantial progress already in cutting emissions. Emissions here, and generally in Europe, emissions per capita are the lowest in the high-income countries. Emissions per capita in Europe are about half what they are in the United States, for example, where they have an awful lot of coal stations and very big cars and things like that. So it's not clear to me that we should be imposing these costs on ourselves ineffectively through the subsidization of wind. I can't resist making the following final point. The wind lobby here in Ireland is remarkably well-resourced, and they snow the media and they've snowed a lot of politicians. They are not farming the wind, they're farming subsidies. And we should be very clear about that. Thanks very much.